Lecture 13, Translating Islamist Discourse. Islamist discourse is becoming increasingly important in political and cultural life in the Arab world. Both oppositions and ruling regimes often articulate and legitimize their position through Islam. But the translation of this discourse is of particular interest not only because of its prevalence and importance, but because of the particular problems it poses theoretically and practically. Firstly, it is a discourse that attempts to speak from outside the orbit of the West and to challenge notions of universality based on European models. Yet few in the West are aware of the basic tenets of this ideology. Some writers, such as Sayyid Qutb, who I will refer to in this lecture, have been hugely influential in the Arab world, but are rarely read by Western readers. More often than not, they read second-hand accounts filtered and digested for them by Western-based academics, always open to the charge of Orientalism. So, all the more reason for Islamists to be heard directly or as directly as translation allows, and all the more reason why the translator's art must be closely scrutinized. We need to see if a text expressly antithetical to another culture can be translated into the language of the other. Secondly, these texts bring with them specific problems for the translator, especially concerning intertextuality, rhetorical devices unfamiliar to most English-speaking readers, and, above all, the connotative and effective aspects of Islamic terminology so consistently used by Islamist writers to persuade the Arabic readership of the truth, moral justification, and even inevitability of their arguments. It will be edifying to see how, or even if, the translators attempt to overcome these problems and with what degree of success. So what is meant by Islamism and therefore by the discourse associated with it? So this is a very important question. So what is meant by Islamism and therefore by the discourse associated with it? Briefly, Islamism is first and foremost a political ideology, and more specifically, one that articulates its analysis of power and its political plan of action through the religious terms and concepts found in Islam. Although the term Muslim fundamentalism is often used in the West, it is deliberately avoided here for two reasons. Firstly, fundamentalism is a term borrowed from a description of radical Christian groups in America, then extended to other religions on the grounds of superficial similarities, clearly describing political movements in the Muslim world in terms of coined for Christian groups in the West, runs into all kinds of problems. So, the term fundamentalism should be avoided here. Why? Because fundamentalism is a term borrowed from a description of radical Christian groups in America. It has been extended to other religions. So, this is a very important reason why fundamentalism should be avoided here in any kind of description. Secondly, the term fundamentalism refers to a belief in the literal truth of the Bible, which liberals in the West see as orthodox. The preferred contemporary view being to see much of the Bible as allegory or metaphor. A belief in the literal truth of the Quran is the mainstream view in Islam and is not what distinguishes Islamist activists from the general population. Accordingly, the term is inappropriate. Working from the premise that Islamism is basically political discourse, what are its features? So if we launch from the premise, if we start with the premise that Islamism is basically political discourse, what are its main features? By referring to main features, it is concluded that all the different Islamist ideologies and groups share something in common. It is as acceptable to talk in general about Islamism as it is to talk about Marxism or liberalism, and that there are features common to most Islamist discourse, although groups may differ widely in their interpretation of this discourse in terms of style and leadership. Perhaps, rather than simply listing a set of core concepts, it would be more instructive to trace the reasons for the emergence of Islam in the latter half of the 20th century as the main challenge to ruling regimes in much of the Muslim world. How is it that states as diverse as Afghanistan, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Turkey, and even Trinidad and Tobago should witness either a direct threat to their power or indeed be overthrown by Islamist groups? For a global explanation rather than a specific one, it is drawn on the work of Bobby Said, not only because he provides an elegant and convincing argument, but also because his thesis is linked to linguistic theory and to modernity. In short, Said sees the emergence of Islamism as a direct result of what is called the dissension of the West, where the West is no longer the uncontested model of human progress and development, and the history of the West cannot be seen as an unchallenged record of that progress. The reasons for this fall from grace are described by a number of authors, many working within a postmodern critique. Some reasons are internal to the West, such as the two world wars, the Holocaust, ecological disaster, and theoretical advocacy of a pluralist and diverse culture, which all question the idea of unilinear progress and universality. The clearest example of an external factor would be decolonization, where political separation usually invokes ideological distancing, although, of course, new independent regimes often come to resemble those they replaced. Interestingly, Robert Young, 1990, traces the origins of postmodern thought to the Arab world itself, to the aftermath of the Algerian War of Independence, and to French writers such as Sartre. Derrida, and Lyotard, who had been affected by the war, and often themselves had strong personal links with Algeria. But perhaps the most salient point in Said's analysis of postmodernism stems from the argument that postmodernism disentangles the West from modernism. So, this argument, or Said's argument, or analysis of postmodernism stems from the argument that postmodernism disentangles the West from modernism. Others have tried to argue that a rejection of the West is a rejection of modernism, but Said holds that the two are no longer conterminous. So the two views are no longer coterminous. Islamism, then, in very general terms, is a rejection of Western or European political models, but not of modernism or progress. Grand Ayatollah Khomeini and Qutb are not anti-modern or indeed anti-science or anti-progress. Hence, another reason for the inappropriacy of fundamentalism, which suggests a return, a going back. They are simply anti or even non-Western, since this is from where much of the popularity of Islam is derived. Modern regimes in the Muslim world, which Said calls Kemalist regimes, have been discredited, and along with them their borrowed Western ideologies. What is required to challenge these regimes is another type of discourse capable of becoming hegemonic or hegemonic. So what is required to challenge these regimes is another type of discourse capable of becoming hegemonic. In other words, a discourse able to describe all other discourses in its terms of dominate in its terms and dominate them. So this is a description of the term hegemonic, which means that a discourse is able to describe all other discourses in its terms and dominate them. Islamist discourse, borrowing as it does so much from Islam itself, has been readily available to take over from failed Western ideologies to offer hope and a political plan of action, untainted by charges of being in the service of Western states or alien to ordinary Muslims' way of life. The linguistic part of Said's account stems from a Caesarean discussion of the relationship between signifier and signified. Signifiers normally refer to more than one signified, the phenomenon of polysemy or polysemy. In temporal terms, they tend to preserve traces of previous articulations, and these traces are organized in chains by the mechanisms of metaphor and metonymy. Nowhere is this more true than in Islam, where terms like hijra and jihad carry layer upon layer of connotative meaning. But what is to stop signification multiplying into meaninglessness? or vague abstraction, given that no signifier has one signified. The potential for slippage is held back or tied into place by nodal points in the structure of a given discourse. These knots of meaning help to stabilize the other elements around them. Islam, then, would be a nodal point in a number of discourses such as fiqh or everyday Muslim worship. Moreover, in a given community, one signifier often comes to symbolize and structure all other discourses because it becomes the concept by which the community is defined. It no longer refers to any one thing because it is too large and operates in so many different discourses and therefore becomes a master signifier, which in Said's words functions as a metonymy for the whole discursive universe. So the Islamist project is to make Islam the master signifier for all discourses, including the political, the cultural, and the social, whereas the regimes it opposes would either prefer Islam to be confined to discourses unconnected with political power, or else claim they represent true Islam and Islamists merely a distortion. So, even in the latter case, secular regimes are perhaps unwittingly being pushed into a corner where political discourse still becomes dominated by the master signifier of Islam, and where they may be less adept at justifying their existence with the relation to Islam than their Islamist opponents. Islam, as a master signifier for Muslim communities, comes to unify and to represent what may otherwise appear fragmented and perplexing, and at the same time to symbolize what Said calls goodness incarnate. Hence, the Islamists claim that the best government is Islamic government amounts to saying that the best government is good government, which is hard to refute unless you try to break the link either between Islam and good or between Islamists and true Islam. So the limits of the master signifier, however, had to be set, and with large signifiers such as Islam or nation. It is often through the attendant notion of evil incarnate, which in the case of a particular nation may be another historical enemy nation, or in the case of Islam as articulated by Islamists, it is Jahiliyyah or society or the West. The general significance from a discourse perspective of this view of Islamism is as follows. It is a form of political discourse, but one which challenges this status both locally and globally by proposing Islam as a master signifier for all discourses, and where Islam symbolizes the greatest good and defines the community rather than the state, language, or tribe. Moreover, it is also defined negatively as antipathetic to the West, to secularism and to local rule. This is, of course, the source of the difficulties any translator will have to overcome when translating these texts into English. How does one successfully translate a master signifier into another frame of reference where it neither identifies a community nor ties together other discursive universes? And how does the translator convey the chains of articulation of terms with other 1400 years of history? Is it possible to communicate to the antagonistic other whose existence is essential to set the boundaries for the new ummah or nation? We can see the cumulative effect of all this on one page of English text, which is in fact exemplified in the following example. It has been quoted at length to show the extent to which the translated text either retains Arabic features or situates itself in non-English discursive patterns. Let's take the following example taken from a book to the great scholar Ibn Qayyim or Ibn al-Qayyim. Its title is Jihad in the Cause of Allah. The great scholar Ibn Qayyim in this book, Zad al-Ma'ad, has a chapter entitled The Prophet's Treatment of the Unbelievers and the Hypocrites, from the beginning of his messengership until his death. In this chapter, he sums up the nature of Islamic jihad. The first revelation from Allah that came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, was Iqra' Bismi Rabbika Ladhi Khalaq. Read in the name of the Sustainer who created. This was the beginning of his prophethood. Allah commanded the Prophet, peace be upon him, to recite this in his heart. The commandment to preach had not yet come. Then Allah revealed, Ya ayyuhal muddathir, qum fanthir. O you who are enwrapped in your mantle, arise and warn. So, Ya ayyuhal muddathir, qum fanthir. Thus, the revelation of Iqra was his appointment to prophethood, while Ya ayyuhal muddathir was his appointment to messengership. Later, Allah commanded the Prophet, peace be upon him, to warn his near relatives, then his people, then the Arabs who were around them, then all of Arabia, and finally the whole world. Thus, for 13 years after the beginning of his messengership, he called people to Allah through preaching without fighting or jizya, and was commanded to restrain himself and to practice patience and forbearance. Then he was commanded to migrate, and later permission was given to fight. Then he was commanded to fight those who fought him, and to restrain himself from those who did not make war against him. Later he was commanded to fight the polytheists, and until Allah was fully established, until Allah's deen or Allah's religion was fully established. After the command for jihad came, the non-believers were divided into three categories: those with whom the Muslims had peace treaties, the people with whom the Muslims were at war, and the hypocrites. This passage contains, as one would expect, words of Arabic origin, now assimilated into English, such as jihad, Allah, and Islamic. Although it is neither feasible nor desirable to suggest alternative translations for these terms, as explained above, they do nevertheless introduce an Arabic element, at least at the phonological level, to the English text. Then we find translating Islamist discourse examples of transliterated Arabic, complete with English gloss, as in Iqra Bismi Rabbika and Ya Ayyuhal Muddathir. Both these Arabic quotations are repeated without gloss later on. It would appear that not only Sayyid Qutb but also the translators expect the reader to be familiar with the Arabic text of the Quran. In addition, there are several examples of transliterated Arabic without English gloss, such as Zad, Al-Ma'ad, Jizya, Deen, and other Islamic terms, although the last example has an English inflection pattern. Clearly, here the non-specialist English language reader would be at a loss to retrieve any meaning from these untranslated terms. The cumulative effect is a sort of hybrid, at times approaching a parallel text. In some instances, it would appear to be a form of code switching, where there is a conscious decision for a speaker to alternate between two codes or languages for a desired communicative effect. Code switching is usually motivated by a change in topic for rhetorical effect, or to exclude someone familiar with only one of the codes. Deliberate exclusion would appear to be a curious motivation for a translator, but another explanation outside of the normal parameters found within the literature on code switching offers itself. This is connected to Muslim belief about the nature of revelation and the unique qualities of the text of the Quran. The Quran is believed to be a fully accurate verbatim record of the message revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by Allah through his intermediary Jibril, the angel. So the sublime literary quality of the surface structure of the message is regarded as part of the proof of its divine origin. How could Muhammad, a clever but illiterate man, have produced such a work without divine intervention? There are also Quranic references to Allah's choice of Arabic as the chosen vehicle for a universal message. All this leads to a special status for the original Arabic text. The message was originally in Arabic for a purpose, and it is considered the duty of all Muslims, irrespective of nationality or mother tongue, to read the Quran in this original form. Translations are used as expedients to aid text exegesis, but Muslims from Birmingham, for example, to Bombay study the text in classical Arabic. This is the reverse of the Protestant position with regard to the text of the Bible as so clearly articulated by Eugene Nida, where the surface form is largely immaterial. What counts is the message itself. As universal truth can be expressed in any language, the original has no special status. Indeed, as Gensler observes, his translation as exegesis obscures the original text to such a degree that it becomes unavailable to the contemporary reader. For Muslims, the original text must never be unavailable, cannot be revised, and is even considered by some to be untranslatable. How can a human translator presume to know the intention of the text producer when that producer is Allah? Hence, those Quranic phrases phonemically translated from the Arabic but not interlingually translated are there as part of a Muslim tradition of leaving quotations from the Quran in classical Arabic, thus retaining their full historicity. The motivation then for the inclusion of untranslated Quranic phrases is not a part of the usual set of motivations for code switching, but the perceived effect for monolingual readers will be the same. Unable to process transliterated Arabic when separated from its gloss, they may be able to grasp the elevated status and special reverence shown to Quranic text, but they will nevertheless be excluded from any understanding of its meaning. Other instances where single Arabic words not yet assimilated into English are simply transliterated cannot be accommodated within an explanation based on the tradition of Quranic quotation. Terms such as jizya, jahiliyyah, deen, and others are well known to any Muslim conversant with the basic tenets of the faith and early Muslim history. They could, however, be translated into English without great difficulty, but there is a clear decision on the part of the translators to use interlingual translation for words with particular reference to the master signifier Islam. An obvious example is the word deen or religion, which could be rendered as religion without too great a shift or loss, but to use more general terms applicable to other religions threatens to break the link with other nodal points to the overall discourse of Islam. If something has two references and one of them refers to other things as well, then the stability of meaning is harder to maintain. The translators appear to avoid losing both this stability and the specificity associated with Islamic terminology by simply rejecting interlingual translation. Unfortunately, it is precisely the meaning of these specific terms and their place in Sayyid Qutb's overall conception of the world that is surely of greatest interest to English language readers unable to read the original. In conclusion, the decentering of the West initiated in this instance by Sayyid Qutb in his speech has continued through the work of the English translators. Like the source text, the translation appears to have been written for a vanguard, for a readership already conversant not only with intertextual reference, but with the surface forms of Quranic Arabic. In fact, in some ways, the English translation expects a greater knowledge of Islamic sources than the Arabic, as many of the bibliographic references to the Quran and Hadith cited in the original are excluded from the English version, although not in any consistent fashion. This is a case of what Basil Hatton calls manifest intertextuality, at least in the original, of course. In the translation, it is nowhere near as manifest, and one is often left wondering what the quotation marks are doing in the text when there is no reference to their source. In short, this version cannot be read by a monolingual, monocultural English reader. These two texts also give the lie to the strong form of the Sapir-Whorf translating Islamist discourse hypothesis that claims that a given natural language inclines its speakers to a particular world view. Perhaps the translators have cheated in having keywords and phrases in transliterated Arabic, but in general, I would argue that the English version is deeply rooted in non-Western discursive patterns as the original. In other words, the translation is neither successful in conveying an antithetical message in the language of the other, nor does it address the problems of intertextuality and specific rhetorical devices which such texts pose for the translator. There is a certain logic to a book originally written for Muslim activists in Egypt to be translated for a corresponding readership in English, but it is unfortunate that such an influential work cannot reach a wider audience, particularly given the widespread misconceptions about Islam and the Arab world that are prevalent in the West. For an English translation to reach such a wider audience, a new version would have to be commissioned, one which relies less on transliteration and which makes intertextual references more manifest. This need not result in complete domestication of the Arabic text. Words conveying complex Muslim social beliefs are entering the English language already. Words such as Ramadan, hijab, etc., although one could also point to those completely distorted such as fatwa and jihad. A more professional and sensitive translation could help to introduce further key concepts such as Jahiliyyah and Ummah into English, but only if readers can follow how these signifiers are structured into other discourses and how they relate to the master signifier Islam. Thank you very much.